Hello, this is NEMYRIALIVE with Lyudmila Nemiria, and we continue our broadcasting from Kiev. And we are very happy that our guest today is Tom Cooper. He is a very famous Austrian military analyst. Tom, hello, and thank you so much to be with us today.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Lyudmila, for inviting me for this interview.
Thank you. Tom, let's start from the Kursk operation. In your absolutely brilliant analysis of this operation, you compare this operation to hunting wild boar. You even use some Germany word, and I cannot just pronounce it, sorry.
It's the Austrian. The Germans would call this Saujagd or wilde Saujagd. We call it in Austria Wildschweinjagd. Wildschweinjagd, yes. Yeah. Sorry for interrupting.
So, boar hunting, why? It is very interesting to compare.
Because the way I understand this operation is foremost aimed to destroy as much of Russian armed forces as possible. Which, now, excuse me for going back to that, I'm already since March 2022 preaching about Ukraine or the Ukrainian armed forces needing the capability to destroy the Russian armed forces big style, destroy the entire companies, regiments, battalions, brigades, even divisions of the Russian armed forces. Of course, one cannot deploy non-conventional means for this, which would be nuclear weapons or chemical weapons. One has to do this with conventional weapons, which means with help of high explosives or bullets or whatever. And this is what we are seeing being done right now. It means the operation or the Ukrainian armed forces are driven into Russia. They have this huge advantage of mobility. They are much faster. They can move from place A to place B much faster than the Russians. They are highly mobile. They're outflanking Russian positions. They are hitting them in the rear, disappearing into the darkness or whatever. You know, they hit and run, then drive another 5 kilometers. Russians over there. One has also to understand, in front of Ukrainian troops, there are always UAVs moving. So you have these UAVs are scouting in front of them. The commanders are checking on their screens what is going on. If they find the Russians, they drive around them, hit them into the flank or into the rear. They do not check what has happened, what is the result of the attack. They do not wait. They just shoot for 10, 15 minutes, disappear, and then disappear, you know, move away and continue further into the Russian rear. And this is ideal for Ukrainian armed forces. Why? We have seen this already in March, April, May, even in June 2022. Because as long as Ukrainians are free to maneuver around the Russian flanks, they can demolish the Russian armed forces. We have seen this. Back then, the entire first Guards Tanks army was destroyed in Sumy and Chernihiv area when it tried to drive over Sumy to Kiev. What happened to it? It was ambushed all the time, hit into the flanks. Its supply convoys were ambushed by the Ukrainian armed forces and so on. The Ukrainian commanders have no problem, you know, if they have no mental problem. If the Russians pass by, you know, and drive down the road, and they are 50 kilometers behind them. This is no problem for Ukrainian commanders because they know our base is here, this is here. Now we are driving into the flank, into the deep flank of the Russian armed forces. But Russians have a massive problem with this. Why? Because they're not trained to think for themselves. The indoctrination of their officers is such that they have to wait for orders from above. And particularly these orders have to be heavily scripted, which means they get a booklet, literally, you do, in case of A, you do this, in case of B, you do this, in case of C, you do that. And then, next page, case A. If the enemy does, you know, hits your flank, you have to reposition your, I mean, this is, you know, process which is taking hours and which they always have to confirm with their commanders in the rear, which means, let's say, Ukrainian unit hits a Russian unit into the flank. Okay, of course, the officer in question reacts by turning his unit to that side, but as next, he's doing nothing. Why? He's first calling his superiors are calling their superiors, And so this can go all the way, from the front line somewhere in Kursk, in Lugovo area, to the headquarters of OSK West or OSK South, then to the Gen staff in Moscow, and then to Ministry of Defense. And then they all are waiting for a decision from the top what to do as next. By the time this decision is taken, the Ukrainians are already 5 kilometers away, or 10 kilometers away, or somewhere else. And this is their problem. And this is why the Russians are currently suffering extremely heavy losses, not only to Ukrainians, but also to chaos in their own system of command. For example, because he has caught Gerasimov several times lying in the last few days. Putin has really, you can see it on his TV appearances. He's sitting there having a TV conference with Gerasimov, just like you and me are now talking, and you see him, the corners of his mouth are like this,
Yes.
Because he knows that Gerasimov is lying to him. So what did he do? His reaction was to reach back on his system upon which he depends for all the time since in power, and not only since he is in power, but he grew up with this system, which is FSB. So he has now ordered the FSB to assume control of this anti-terrorist operation against Ukrainian invasion of Russia. And why? Because for them, on one side he's feeling safe in this under these circumstances. When he's working with FSB, he knows the system. He knows how he can depend on his subordinates to more or less report to him truly, to inform him what is really going on the battlefield. That is why. And on the other side, he can continue in his cold and calculated fashion, which means he has absolutely no connection to the suffering of Russian troops, to the flight of reportedly 190,000 Russian civilians from the combat zone, and so on. He does not care about all of this, and he needs not to care. So FSB is now assuming the command, and FSB is supposed to fight the Ukrainian armed forces. I mean, this is a ridiculous situation, because just like SBU can't fight the Russian invasion of Ukraine, excuse me for expression, we see this time and again. So also the FSB cannot fight the Ukrainian invasion of Russia. It is an intelligence source, and if you like, intelligence and security service, no source, sorry. It is not a military service. Of course, FSB has its own, let's call them security, Spetsnaz kind of formations, but they are very small. The FSB primarily, if there is an armed service controlled by FSB, it's the border guards, Russian border guards, but they have no heavy armament. And we see them also, dozens of border guards captured, dozens of FSB captured by Ukrainian armed forces, 45 FSB or something like this. I counted in just one video 2 or 3 days ago. So, they're messing around, and this mess is going to increase further because of this mistrust between Putin and Gerasimov, and therefore control via FSB. This is, just like if Stalin would have ordered NKVD to command the Soviet armed forces during the German invasion in 1941. I mean, absolutely insane. But this is the way he is ruling, and this is the way he thinks and the way he acts. Now, of course, all the officers of the Russian armed forces must be afraid of repercussions if they do a mistake or something else. So everybody, is all the time watching behind his back if he's going to get stabbed or shot or whatever else, or fall down the steps and then down out of the window at the end of the steps, in such things. So from that point of view, the Ukrainian operation is ideal because it's creating a chaos in this perceived order or rule of law and order in system Putin. Perfect. You don't need to think about what kind of diplomatic, what kind of political, what kind of military, or whatever other repercussions or results this might have. The operations, as I said, this is why I'm calling it this way, is a Wildschweinjagd because it's aimed to destroy the Russian armed forces. Okay, early, the first few days, it was just, minor units or miscellany of units, like 488 motor rifle regiment, border guards, Akhmat, and whatever was around. Meanwhile, there are battalion and not only regiment, but actually brigade-sized reinforcements appearing. But what happens once the Russian armed forces appear in the Kursk area? They arrive, by road or usually by train. They unload, and somebody there tells them, okay, move down the highway E38 and then attack towards south. But no further information, no further intelligence. They don't know what kind of opponent are they going to encounter. They don't know even where. So they are driving down this E38 highway. They get hit by HIMARS or other means of long-range weaponry in Ukrainian arsenals. Meanwhile, they don't know even why have they got hit or how, because they do not know that they've been tracked by Ukrainian UAVs all the time from a distance. So, okay, if they survive this part of the trip, they turn south and then, or they travel south and then turn west, and then try to attack. What happens as next? There is such a chaos in the Russian chain of command that as next they are regularly getting hit by their own air force. Means the VKS, the Russian Airspace Force, is regularly bombing or rocketing on troops 15 to 20 kilometers behind the line of contact, which means they are still in the process of traveling from Kursk to the combat zone, and they get hit by their own air force. Yesterday, there was not just one, but two convoys hit, one artillery battery, and there was a motor rifle battalion moving by trucks towards the Belovaia, or what is the name of the area, and they got hit by Russian helicopters and smashed, really cut to pieces, severe losses in personnel, destroyed heavy equipment, destroyed trucks, and so on and so on. So this is the kind of chaos, which means that in turn, because of the chaos at the top, because of the chaos between the commanders, there is a chaos in the heads of their pilots and chaos in the heads of commanders on the ground, not to talk about the troops. And then mind what kind of troops are these. The first units they have sent to reinforce Kursk, they're all reserve units of different fronts in Ukraine. For example, 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, 810 Naval Infantry Brigade. But this is, just the title. The unit actually, meanwhile, consists largely of a mix of mobilized reserve troops, which are 38, 40, 45 years old, and sailors from Russian Navy warships. Which means they are so short on personnel, meanwhile, they are, they put their ship into the port, anchor it, and that's it. The ship stands there, the crew is taken to the shore, and you go now serving as infantry in Ukraine. So they bring such troops to the Voronezh area and to the Kursk area. They train them as infantry for 2 or 3 or 4 weeks, and then send them to the front line. So this is the kind of units Ukrainians are facing. And this kind of units cannot fight a mobile warfare because they haven't received enough training for this. You need your 4 or 5 weeks just to learn to use your rifle. And then to learn to use your rifle by fighting as a team, as a squad, or a company-sized unit, you need another 2 or 3 weeks. Then you need another 4 or 5 weeks, or even longer, to learn to fight as a company within a battalion, not to talk about regiment or a brigade. This is all taking times. As next, except for infantry weapons, the weaponry they are running out of stocks of heavy weapons. Which means that the tanks they're giving to such troops, they're old. They're from 1950s, 1960s, T-55, T-62, and so on. They do not have T-72 tanks. These are sent only to their best units, which are losing them, 10 by day. Then artillery pieces. I mean, D-30s are, even D-30 stocks are out. They are meanwhile replacing them with M46 and other old artillery pieces. So it's getting ever poorer and poorer equipment, and this equipment is simply not as effective as modern equipment. And the ammunition they are using is North Korean, Iranian, especially North Korean ammunition has very poor quality control. It's regularly blowing up inside the guns of the artillery pieces and so on. So this is adding to confusion, to shocks, I'm sometimes lacking words for what kind of chaos is there in Russia meanwhile. Of course, they are Russians, and Ukrainians have invaded holy land of Russia, and all this Rodina, and they are fighting for Rodina. They are highly motivated because of this, even though they are very tired. All of these troops. This is also another characteristic. Many of these troops sent as first reinforcements to Kharkiv are tired, dead tired, because they have already spent the last 3, 6, 9, 12, or 15 months fighting in Ukraine and fighting this terrible, awful, casualty-rich, grinding battles for advance against well-fortified Ukrainian positions. So these troops are now, without any kind of respite, sent over to fight a highly mobile enemy which is dancing around them, shooting into their back at every opportunity, and so on. So this is just increasing chaos. Of course, again, Ukraine has invaded Russia. This is a matter of fact. In their heads, this is, in the heads of Russian commanders and in the heads of Russian troops, there is no better motivation for this, because this time it's for real. It's not just some Ukro-Nazis fighting, mass murdering Russians in Ukraine, but it is, really a NATO invasion on Russia. This is how they explain this to themselves. Really, you have videos of Ahmad and Russian officers explaining, this is NATO, this is British style operation, this is French. We have seen French troops, they have taken them, they have withdrawn these units from the border to Belarus, brought them over here, this is French Foreign Legion, and this is British, and blah, blah, blah. So this is how they see it. This is a NATO invasion. The Ukrainians couldn't do this anymore. This must be NATO. This is their explanation for all this. So they are better motivated in this regard, even if awfully tired. I mean, you can ask your own troops. One of the biggest complaints from the last week or so in Kursk was that the Russian troops they are capturing, they're taking as prisoners of war, as stinking. Why? Because they haven't taken shower in months or longer. I mean, can you imagine a human being that at these temperatures outside, you have 30 plus degrees, 40 degrees at noon, and this day in, day out serving, outside in the field, and you haven't taken a shower for 1 month. I can tell you, you smell, one can smell you from 10 meters away. So, nevertheless, they are now highly motivated because this is the NATO invasion. Okay, fine. But again, in grand total, the purpose of the operation is to kill as many, to destroy the Russian armed forces. And this is best done in Ukrainian fashion, which is highly mobile warfare, this quick movement from one position to another, driving around the enemy flanks, driving into enemy flanks, into the enemy rear, and so on. And this is what is working. And this is working much better than all the defense in Donbass, because as long as Ukrainian units are moving, Russians have extreme problems alone with finding them, not to talk about targeting them. Just the best example, this is just one example out of dozens, but best example, this CAB or UMPK glide bombs, you have to enter the coordinates into the navigation system of the combat aircraft before the flight, which means the bomb cannot, you can't retarget this bomb to some target once the aircraft is airborne, but this is not usually done. And firstly and secondly, the bomb itself cannot track a mobile target. You cannot use it to hit a tank which is moving, which means you are striking a fixed position. You're using them only to strike fixed position. And as long as Ukrainian units are moving, you cannot use these bombs to strike them with them. So this is one advantage. This is lessening, the Ukrainian losses by a wide margin, although they are outside in the open and moving all the time, so they are exposed to the enemy fire. So again, there are lots of advantages. This is just one of them from this kind of operation. And there are no, 20 kilometers deep minefields. There are no kind of very well developed systems of defense on the Russian side. The Ukrainians can really move freely over the countryside, from forest to forest, for example, or cross rivers where the Russians do not expect them to do, like this has happened south of Suja 3 days ago. So perfect conditions for Ukrainian armed forces.
Tom, what I worried really about is about what's next, because you explain very interesting and with great arguments that this mobile war is a very good chance for Ukraine army.
Yeah.
But we remember that the positional war is a complicated situation, because, as you say, even these corps strikes fifth position. And in that case, what will be next step with this Kursk operation? If, for example, we continue to move, it's just one story, but we can't continue, months or 10 days, because I think that Russia will, be ready and to take all forces which it can and to push against Ukrainian army. But if we, just make some position in Russia,
okay,
we will be in the same situation like on Donbass.
Yes, but inside Russia.
Yeah, but what do you think? What scenarios are possible? Is it a big risk for Ukrainian army to stay and to fix their position in Russia? How it could look like?
Look,
I worry about it.
I understand your worries, but principal issue here is Ukraine is all the time at risk, all the time, every day, and not since yesterday, but already for 10 years at least, if not longer. Because it borders Russia, and Russia, or at least the Russian president, thinks it is a matter of survival of Russia and especially of himself, of his own regime, of System Putin, to control Ukraine. So this is why we are exposed to Russian attacks of all kinds: political attacks, subversion, assassinations, manipulations, bribery, and so on and so on. The list is really long. Since the late 1990s, actually. You are also exposed to threats with nuclear strikes and so on. So you are constantly at risk. Constantly. There is no difference in this regard. So now the question is, what is the factor which is really embodying this risk? What kind of thing is there that is making this risk or this threat real? This is the Russian armed forces. Destroy the armed forces, and Putin can bubble the entire day, no problem. So this is the point. This is why I said Vilchvanyard, because the aim of the operation, the way I understand it, is to destroy the Russian armed forces. You cannot destroy all of them at once. You cannot destroy them in 1 week, you cannot destroy them in 2 weeks, but you can destroy them much, much faster the way the Ukrainian armed forces are doing this right now, through a mobile operation into Russia, than through sitting in Ukraine in Donbass and waiting for Russians to come in and to attack. And this is why, when you talk about risk, it is highly risky, but it is a calculated risk. Why? Because the Russian armed forces do not have the capability anymore to run big operations, in armies and divisions, moving, huge formations over hundreds of kilometers. We have all you foremost in Ukraine, but also all the NATO generals and then everybody else. We have to adjust the way we are thinking. We need to stop measuring the Russian armed forces in Western or Ukrainian methods. We have to understand that there is no this. We are used to think about the Russian armed forces as this huge Soviet mechanized juggernaut which can drive 500 kilometers over Germany into France or to Belgium or Netherlands or whatever. It can't. We have seen this in March 22. They can't do this. The army fell apart just while trying to do this, but there was relatively little Ukrainian resistance. When you check what was happening to the first Guards Tanks army, but trying to drive around Sumy and then to Brovary, I mean, this is silly. The same with 41st Combined Arms Army, which was trying to drive to Chernihiv. It fell apart before reaching the city. Nobody knew where are commanders. Half of vehicles was broken. There was no fuel, no food, nothing. In the middle of February. So the troops were freezing. They thought they are going to some exercise. The others thought that the Ukrainians are going to greet them as liberators and whatever. Total chaos. And what a surprise, the army fell apart. And what a surprise, 2 deputy commanders of that army were killed in a matter of days while trying to sort out the situation on the front line. And even 1 month later, they still were unable to seize Chernihiv. I mean, against this, in the face of the Chernihiv was protected by 2 brigades plus of Ukrainian army, and there was an entire 1.5 Russian army coming down their way, and it didn't manage to pulverize them. I mean, this is, and we have to realize this. We have to understand that the Russian army, no matter how many tanks and artillery pieces it has got, is not the Soviet army. It has no similar firepower. It has no similar capability of operating over huge distances and moving large contingents of units, and mechanized formations and so on. What we see the last 1.5 years actually is this constant. They're sending squadron and company-sized assaults into Donbass. They're saturating the same place with 10 or 12 such attacks every day. Where it's always between 5, 20, and 50 troops per attack, nothing more, because they can't, because they do not have the officers, they do not have the supplies, they do not have the means to organize a big style operations. Yes, time and again, 2 or 3 times a month, they do organize a battalion-sized operation when there are 40, 50 vehicles and 200 to 400 troops, and then they send them to assault some Ukrainian position. But what happens in every single such case? Every single time this unit is destroyed by Ukrainian defense and firepower. So this is what we can expect right now in Kursk as well. Of course, Kursk is much closer to Russian supply system and logistics system and so on, but this system is not working better inside Ukraine or in Kursk. It is the same system, which means it cannot do better, the commanders cannot do better, and the troops cannot do better. So is this really that much riskier? I would say unless Ukrainian general staff or one or another brigade commander does some major mistake and loses really a significant contingent of his troops, there is no major risk. Which means unless the Ukrainians can move around and dance around the Russian troops, nothing major is going to happen. What I expect actually rather to happen is, I'm going to now do something I'm not usually doing, make a prediction. Sooner or later, Gerasimov is going to line up his units somewhere north of the E38 highway, for example, or from Kursk down in southern direction. He's going to line up, he's going to pull together enough reserves to literally line up his units and create this new defense front line. And until it's so far, nothing is going to change. And even then, there's going to be a major problem. What to do with this front line? In order to protect this front line, in order to prevent Ukrainians from penetrating and driving even deeper into Russia, he will have to create huge minefields, just like in southern Zaporozhye and other parts of Ukraine, which means 10 or 15 kilometers deep minefields. And then that's it. If he wants to counterattack Ukrainians, he will have to cross this. He will have to send his troops to cross these minefields first. Another problem. So it is going to take some time for him to bring enough units from Ukraine up to Kursk, then to create such a front line, the defense line, then to mine it, protect it well enough to stop the Ukrainian advance, and then only can he start thinking about a counterattack. And because he knows he can send his troops into counterattacks as the situation is right now, but they are only going to get smashed, whether by his own forces, whether by the Air Force, or by the Ukrainian armed forces. So I do not see the situation that risky. I do not. What other risk would there be? I mean, of course, yes, at some point in time, not Ukrainian, but Putin might lose patience and say, oh, this is a threat for Ukraine, for Russian sovereignty and whatever, and then pull out nuclear weapons again and threaten with them. But he knows the moment he uses just one nuclear weapon, he's going to be nuclearized as first by NATO, because NATO is not going to tolerate this. It might then take its time to sit down for 5 to 7 or 10 or 15 days and think about shall we or shall we not. But the situation is absolutely clear. The moment Russians deploy nuclear weapons in Ukraine, NATO is striking back at Russia, and then Putin is going to be the first to have nothing to rule over. So we have all the eventualities closed. The fundamental problem of all of this is Putin has launched this war under entirely wrong circumstances. This is a massive strategic mistake. He thought he's going to overrun Ukraine in a few weeks at least. Perhaps not in 3 days, but at least in a few weeks. And he was gambling, just like in Syria, that he is going to get through with this situation, that the West is not going to do a lot except to complain and blah, 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 and protest and so on, like in Syria, and that he could get away with it. And this is what he's doing all the time. He came away with such behavior in Chechnya. He came away with such behavior in Georgia. He came away with such behavior in Syria, in Mali, here and there, and so on. In Ukraine, he has experienced something which he didn't expect, which is massive resistance of Ukrainians, and he can't get away with it. Even if NATO is still delivering, just a fiction of what it could theoretically. So it's a game. This time the gamble is not working. It has failed, and now he's again going to try to gamble with something. And what shall he do, and how, and so on and so on. But there are situations where even gamblers like him cannot continue gambling anymore. So the best way for him is what he has been told by several Western spokespersons over the last 2 days. He can anytime withdraw his troops from Ukraine, and Ukrainians are going to withdraw from Russia. It's as simple as that. Very simple.
Tom, does it mean that this Kursk operation could have dramatic influence for the whole war or the whole situation on the battlefields? Does it mean?
Well, it certainly already has dramatic consequences. The question is just the extension of these dramatic consequences. We are yet to see. This might take a little bit longer, or let's say I hope it's going to take a little bit longer, but it is going to happen. This is what I hope, that it is going to happen, that at some point in time the Russian losses in Kursk are going to reach a proportion where they have to withdraw major units from Ukraine. This is not yet the case. It was just a few brigades and foremost regiments and battalions. But the best solution, or best outcome would be to force the Russians to withdraw several divisions out of Ukraine. So to make it impossible for their armed forces inside Ukraine to continue assaulting in Donbass, for example. In that case, that would buy time for Ukraine to rebuild its forces and so on. But on the political there is not. I do not expect a lot to happen because Putin has such a good control over the Russians. Meanwhile, he has them really totally under control. The entire state, the entire economy, the armed forces. I mean, when you have a major intelligence and security service like FSB controlling everything and everybody, you're in perfect position as a dictator because you really control everybody, including the organized crime. So I do not expect politically a lot to change. What would be necessary for this would be an even bigger defeat of the Russians, or at least for the Russians to suffer even more losses within a shorter period of time. And for this, I'm not sure that Ukraine has enough firepower right now, at least not the units currently deployed inside Kursk. Why? Because they simply have the same situation like in Donbass, which is that they don't have enough artillery ammunition for, mauling now entire brigades or divisions of the Russian armed forces. This is not yet here. But it is, it is a step in the right direction. It is showing that if one attacks the Russians where they do not expect, if one does something the Russians do not expect, they are in deep trouble. So whatever they do now as next, they will have to strongly reinforce their troop presence along the border to Ukraine instead of sending additional reserves to Ukraine. So this is positive. Firstly. Secondly, they'll have to waste a lot of ammunition and supplies and equipment for fighting Ukrainians inside Russia instead in Ukraine. So this is also positive because it's not causing additional damage to Ukraine and so on and so on. This is the primary positive results of this operation. And what the politicians then do out of that, now or in 5 days or in 5 months or 5 years, who knows? Who knows? This is absolutely unpredictable. You have such a situation in so many wars, in so many wars that you have clear-cut military victory, but on the political scene, it's a total loss and nothing worse. We have seen this, especially in Syria, where when was that? Back in 2020. Erdogan's armed forces have defeated Assadist armed forces and IRGC and whatever were Russians around, and still Erdogan then, went to negotiate with Putin, got drunk with too much vodka, and said, yeah, okay, you have your way, and we are withdrawing from Western Idlib. And what happened? The Russians won, although on the battlefield they lost. It was a clear-cut defeat. So it was such a terrible defeat that Tehran was down to threatening to fire rockets or missiles at Istanbul. So I said, military situation is ideal for the ZSU. Political is then to follow. We are going to see what happens. As regards to the second part of your question, how long can the ZSU do this? This is clear. There is a clear answer to this. This can be run for, by same units for around 10-15 days. After that, they are going to be too exhausted to continue at the same speed, moving all the time. Because you have to keep in mind the troops are sleeping perhaps 2 or 5 hours a day, and otherwise they are moving all the time from one position to another, or scouting somewhere, or attacking, or whatever. So this, we have seen this already also in Eastern Kharkiv back in September, October 22. The unit drove into the Russian rear with the order drive to Kupiansk. They have reached Kupiansk within a week. They have managed, to cross the Oskil River for another week and so on and so on. But after that, they were simply exhausted. So from that point of view, unless the units currently fighting in Kursk are replaced, or largely replaced at least, this is going to go on for at least a week longer, and then we have to expect to slow down because Ukrainians are going to your troops are going to be exhausted. So from that point of view, we can expect another week. What happens afterwards, we are going to see.
Tom, thank you so much. Thank you so much to be with us. Yeah, thank you.